When Brad asked me or talked to me about possibly coming and tying along with where Jim was going with his presentation, I thought what I'd do is just kind of give you a brief picture of some of the utility work zones and the short-term work that we see out on the roadway, and then just briefly touch on what kind of we do in our training program when we train or bring somebody up to speed with short-term work. And I titled the presentation, our training program is titled The Presentation is a Way of Life. There's a reason for that. We, like Jim mentioned, we want to make sure that everybody goes home at the end of the day. And when you do this properly out on the roadway, potentially the results are going to be good, that we're going to have people go home at the end of the day, not only the workers in the work zone, but also the motorists and the pedestrians that are out there. This actually is a fatal accident, a photograph of a fatal accident that occurred on the West Coast. And a flagger was killed here in this particular accident. And this was the vehicle that struck that flagger, struck a arrow board on this site. And the person, the flagger, ended up losing their life in this short-term work zone. I've worked with a number of utility companies out on the roadway. And obviously I've got a number of horror stories, but in this particular case, this was actually could have been a horror story, but we had trained this utility company, and you can see, even though the lanes here, what they've done is they've occupied this lane on this side of the roadway here. You can see the double solid line here, and they've split the other lane. Now, there isn't really enough room here for two lanes technically, but they've done the best that they could by splitting the two lanes to keep mobility happening. So they're a bit off there. They could have had wider lanes, but what happened in this particular accident is they had a woman who was going home from work at about 2:30 in the morning, and she had driven down this side of the roadway to take a friend and drop her off, and then about 15 minutes later she came back through this side of the work zone, and they believe possibly because of the late hour and her tiredness that she fell asleep, and this is where she parked her car. There's a 12-inch water main in the bottom of that hole. This is a water company. This is a 12-inch water main, and she basically peeled her car into that excavation. And about 5 minutes before she ended up in that hole, there were 3 employees in that hole. So those gentlemen that were in the hole actually avoided a serious accident when she ended up in this work site. They did have a bunch of cones out on the roadway. They had coned the lanes. They had advanced warning signs out here. They were close to being set up by the standard, and they had been trained. We trained this company basically almost yearly. We trained this company on work zone issues. When I do this training, I ask the question, what is the need to do traffic control? Why do we do it? And there's some things that are happening out on the roadway that potentially can affect your workers out on the roadway. Number one, the infrastructure that we have has fallen apart. And in the process of that infrastructure falling apart, more and more people are working out on the roadway. And there's a couple of issues that happen out there that can cause some serious difficulty for your employees as they work on the roadway. As the infrastructure falls apart and people drive through work zone after work zone after work zone, we see sometimes a desensitization of the motorists to the work zone. And when that happens, it can cause problems for your workers in the work zone. And there's a lot of people doing work out on the roadway across the board, not only utility companies, but you got contractors, you got DOT themselves, you got crews working for municipalities and townships and counties. There's all kinds of work happening out on the roadway. The other thing that's happening is the work zone patterns or the roadways that you're working on, their patterns are changing. We're widening roadways to handle volume, and as the traffic pattern changes, there's issues that go along with that out on the roadway. There's changing driver habits. Most states are dealing with issues related to people who are talking on cell phones and working with distractions inside the vehicle. And those things are causing more difficulties in not only in work zones, but on the roadway itself. One of the other issues you're dealing with is we have an aging public. The baby boom generation is moving into retirement years. And that's one of the issues that you're dealing with out on the roadway in terms of the abilities of the motorist behind the wheel of the car. And then we have visual noise. We have all kinds of issues that are happening that are distracting the motorist's attention. And then finally, the last thing that is a difficulty in the work zone is the attitude of the employee. I just spoke here earlier in one of the sessions. I talked about a case study of an accident that happened up in Albany, New York, with a utility company, and the personnel habits of the worker, his attitude towards work zone traffic control, potentially contributed to part of the incident. What I want to do is just show you a couple of short-term work zones that are set up out on the roadway, and kind of look at them from a perspective of how they were set up and how they should have been set up by the standard. This is typically what we do: is we go out on the roadway and we actually take field shots of a work zones that we're trying to help the company get in compliance with. And this happens to be a 45-mile-an-hour multi-lane roadway in a corporate kind of area out in Illinois. And as you can see, you come up on this work zone, there's no advance warning sign to let you know as the motorist that the lane that you're traveling in, this lane right here, is completely closed as you go around that corner a little bit. And really what happens is you come up on this work zone at 45 miles an hour, and the only advance warning device is that arrow board, which if you read the MUTCD standard, this basically is not a standalone device in the work zone. If you close that lane, you need to notify the motorist in advance of that, potentially that the lane is closed with some advance warning signs. And the entire work zone consists of these 4 cones in the cone taper, the 4 around the truck, and that arrow board. And from a helicopter view, this is the way that work zone was set up. And potentially, if you wanted to come close to meeting the requirements of the MUTCD standard, this would have been the minimum requirements. Now, I don't have the footage distances out here about how far these signs would be placed out on the roadway, but that lane closure, the motorist should have been notified with these advance warning signs that the lane was closed, and potentially you could have coned it this way to let traffic get out here and put that arrow board there, or potentially you could have done it this way, kind of leaving that opening there to get into that parking lot that was over here. But this would have been kind of the minimum guidelines that the federal standard would have proposed for this particular short-term work zone that this company was doing out on the roadway. And in actuality, we had about a year after these photographs were taken, I had an employee that actually was killed in this same type of scenario. He was sitting at that box right there. That's what this telephone company is doing, is they're doing a little switch work right there and splicing work at that box. And the guy was actually sitting at the box doing that work. And basically, here's what happened. A motorist come down this roadway here. They didn't know about the work zone because there was no advance warning. They went to move over into this lane, and the car was in their blind spot. And so they had to correct and make a decision of what to do. By that time, they were on top of the work zone. And so they swerved back into the lane that they came out of, and now they're going to hit this arrow board in the back end of the truck. So they decided that wouldn't be a good choice. So where's the only other place for them to go? They jumped the curb. And unfortunately, when they jumped the curb, the guy was sitting at that box right there and had wiped that guy out at the box and ended up killing the employee. So it is a very serious matter, this issue of protecting the work zone for short duration type work. This happens to be another work zone that we were on that I called the safety director for this utility company and invited him out to this scene because of the way this intersection was not signed by this particular utility company. This is a state right-of-way, a state DOT roadway about 45 miles an hour in my hometown. I live in western New York. And this is Route 14 in my hometown, and this is a side street, 30 miles an hour. And the crew that we're talking about is sitting right there around the corner. Now what they're doing is they're doing a change out of some transformers on the utility poles around the corner. We were just looking at the work zone from where that blue car is right there. We're now looking up the roadway they're on. The only advance warning signs for this lane closure was a sign right next to that blue car, and then there's one over here next to this white vehicle right here. And what they've done is they've taken the entire lane of traffic here going north on this particular roadway. You cannot go, actually going west, you cannot go up this roadway west. If you want to, if you're this car right here waiting for the light and you want to go up this roadway, you're being put head on into the left-hand turning lane with the traffic coming at you right there. which is most likely not the best place for you to be driving your automobile right now, okay? Now, I was at this site for one change of this light, and these guys were here at this site for approximately 8 hours as they worked on this transformer that was up there, and they did some line work here for this particular utility company. Now, while I was there, I want to show you how a couple of accidents almost happened. There's a guy coming down this hill right there. He's in a dark blue Bonneville, and what he wants to do is he wants to come in and get in this lane right here and turn left and go out here north on Route 14. The problem is a bunch of motorists are going to come up to this stop line that are turning left here, and they're turning up this roadway, and they're going to leak out past that stop line and sit underneath the light and wait for an opening to be able to turn left. Do you guys see the head-on accident coming? Okay, so here's what happens. These three cars right here were waiting underneath the light. They turned left, and they started head-on into that guy coming down the hill, getting into that lane. So he had to make a decision. Do I hit the people coming at me? Do I swerve back into the lane that I came out of? What do I do? Well, he makes a decision. Instead of hitting the folks coming at him, he stays in the straight ahead lane. He swerves back over, and he almost hit a guy in his blind spot who was trying to pass him in that straight ahead lane because he was moving into the left turning lane. So they sorted that out a little bit afterwards. I'm sure somebody wasn't too happy and probably told him what he thought of him. And they finally get parked here in the intersection, and they're now in the straight ahead lane over here, but the guy that's in the front is the guy who wants to turn left. This guy's going straight ahead. Where do you think this car's going? He's in the left only lane. Where do you think he's going? Straight ahead or left? He's actually going to go straight ahead, and they're going to race one another across the intersection to see who can get the shot up the roadway as they start here. So here they go. The guy on the right wins. And then this guy goes straight through the intersection. There's the car that's now swerved out around the car that's waiting to turn left to go straight ahead. Remember, this is one change of the light, and they start going through this intersection, okay? Now, as they do this, here's the guy going straight ahead. This van's going left. Where do you think this guy's going, left or straight ahead? He's actually going to go straight ahead. Now, this is the problem right here. This car just entered the work zone at 30 miles an hour. And he's going to swerve over here to go straight ahead, and he thinks this car is going where? Left. There's the car that was coming down the hill that almost had the head-on accident. He now has enough time to make the left-hand turn. So this guy's going to swerve over here, and watch what happens. He has to slam on his brakes and just gets his car stopped before he impacted the side of that line truck as this guy drove out of his blind spot and went straight ahead in this intersection. That's one change of the light, and this crew was here for approximately 6 hours that day, okay? So this is typically what we see in utility work zones. This is the way the work zone was set up, and now I'm going to be very brief here. This is potentially one of the ways they could have done it. They needed a lot more signs here, but I'm just going to give you an idea of the possibility of doing it this way, and this probably would have been the minimum. They needed to put signs on these two other roadways and potentially cone this lane that they had taken away and give that lane back. Now, I would have put a sign out here that said no left turn here and force this traffic straight through here and into another area over here. There was a whole bunch of other ways to do this, but they obviously didn't tell any of the other intersecting traffic coming into this work zone that they were up there, okay? Now, out of all the photos I've taken for the 20 years that I've been in this business, this utility company got this entire work zone proper. They set it up exactly how it should have been. Here's why. Note, now, trust me, there's a crew out here along the right-of-way. This is Route 15 coming up out of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and they got everything right. Here's why. They were 300 yards off the road in the middle of this cornfield. They did not need any traffic control at that point. Because the federal standard tells us that if we're more than 15 feet from the furthest edge of the roadway, or 2 foot past a curb edge, if this happened to be an asphalt curb or a concrete curb, if we're 2 feet past it or 15 feet past it, we potentially can eliminate the traffic control devices that we use on the roadway. When we're closer to the roadway than those distances, we better be following the requirements of the standard that Jim mentioned here just a few moments ago. He mentioned the number of fatalities. This is a chart that we've done over the years related to the fatalities, and you'll notice that beginning almost in the year 2000, We had 800 and some there in the year 2000, and starting after that, all the way through 2001 through 2006, we've lost about 1,000 people in work zones. And then this year it's dropped quite dramatically. In 2007, it dropped down to that 835 number. So we're getting better, but still, this is far too many people dying in work zones. The standard Jim mentioned, the minimum standard is the Federal Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We're now in a revision year of that, and we're probably looking at a new manual sometime late this year or early next year, with a bunch of revisions that's been being made to the standard since 2003. Jim mentioned that OSHA gets involved through this construction standard, which you probably are familiar with. Hopefully you're familiar with that, because OSHA writing citations on this issue is happening. And then every state deals with the federal manual in a number of different ways. Most of them adopted the federal standard. Some write their own supplements above and beyond the Fed standard. And then you have other issues in the states you're dealing with like qualified products list, as well as their permitting practices for construction and maintenance operations and that sort of thing related to short-term work. I mentioned OSHA. Here's how OSHA is getting involved. OSHA will cite you out of the General Duty Clause 5A, and they will also cite you under 1926.200. The electric utilities industry and the telecommunications industry have both their own standard, and in these two standards they refer to this and also are covered by General Duty 5A. And I do have one company that actually has been cited under OSHA requirements in the federal manual, and they were hit with a serious violation for not wearing safety vests and flagging without stop-slow paddles. And in that particular case, that company, that serious violation, has now put them on probation for 3 years, and if they have another violation that is considered a willful violation that's life-threatening, the fine can go from $30,000 to $70,000, depending on what type of day the OSHA inspector's having that day. But this is the OSHA standard and how it reads related to following the MUTCD as the requirements for your work zone. I'm going to skip over this because Jim talked about fundamental principles of safe traffic management, and what I want to do is, and Jim also showed you the stages of the work zone. So what I'd like to do is this is what we train on a short-term work for a utility company. We train these three key elements are what you really need to work on or know in order to help you pick a typical application out of the federal standard, and also to be able to figure out the length of a cone taper, the type of cone taper you're using, and how many cones and that sort of thing to put in it. I'm not going to get real detailed on that, but these are the three things that we typically teach a short-term company that's doing short-term work out on the roadway. We teach their employees they need to determine three things. Number one, which typical application they may follow out of the standard. Again, it might have to be adjusted based on the conditions. We teach them how to determine which cone taper they have to pick and how many cones are in that and how long the taper is. And then if they choose to use a buffer space, we teach them how to find the length of that buffer zone and the number of cones they need. When you do this selection criteria for a typical application, you have to look at four things: work duration, work location, roadway type, and the type of work that you're doing out on the roadway. And when you read the federal manual, they fall into these categories. For work duration, these are the 5 different categories that you have, or 6 different categories that you have for work duration. And once you determine how long you're going to be there in one of these categories, it will help steer you to the right typical application. Also, the same thing related to where your work is located out on the roadway. You got to determine which one of these categories you fall into. Remember, I mentioned outside the shoulder edge is that 15-foot and 2-foot distance. You're on the shoulder with no encroachment, on the shoulder with a minor encroachment, within the median or in the traveled roadway. So you determine where your work is located. And then finally, you determine which type of roadway you're on. And once you do that with those 3 categories of things, pretty much your work is going to be determined already, what type of work you're doing. Once you do those 3 things, you can pick a typical drawing like this. And then the drawing is going to actually show you how many signs potentially you need, how to lay out your cone taper, your buffer space, and the cones around it, where the workspace, and you can then modify this drawing. So that's kind of how you pick a typical drawing on how to set up a work zone out on the roadway. That's the first thing we teach employees to do. Here's another example of one of those typical drawings out of a pocket guide that we actually make for the utility industry. Once you determine that typical drawing, you then have a table in the back of the book. If your state allows you to use this table gives you the sign spacing distances that you could put your signs out on the roadway, and that will show you where to put the signs in the distance that they're out on the roadway. The second thing we teach is this cone taper, how to determine which type of taper you use. And actually in the federal manual, this is the taper we're talking about. And actually in the federal manual, there's 5 different types of tapers: a merge taper, a shift taper, a shoulder taper, a downstream taper, and a 1-lane 2-way flagger taper. We then teach your employees how to determine which type of taper they're going to use. And then once they're able to do that, then there's a formula in the federal manual to determine the length of the cone taper. And what we've actually done in our book is we've taken that formula and we've calculated the tapers already for the lane widths that you're going to be using. And so if you were closing a lane at 30 miles an hour and it was a 12-foot lane, you're going to come over here and it's going to be 180 feet long with this merge taper, and it's going to have 7 cones approximately in that taper. So we teach your crews how to determine which type of taper to use, then how to find the length of that taper and how many cones they need in it. That's the second thing a crew would have to do to help set up a typical application properly out on the roadway and that short-term work zone. And then the final thing that they would have to do is to determine if they chose to use this buffer space. We actually show them in the work zone where that buffer space is. It's this space here where no equipment or personnel can be, and it's kind of a deceleration area to get a motorist stopped who made the wrong decision. It's an optional area. And if they choose to use that buffer zone, then we teach them to go to this table here, which is the table referred to in the manual for stopping distance as a function of speed. And we take 30 miles an hour, and the zone is there at 200 feet with 7 cones. So we teach the employee how to then do those 3 things to help them set up a work zone properly on the roadway. And the final thing I'll talk to you about here before I just show you a couple examples of the wrong type of temporary traffic control devices to use is we suggest you as a company, if you're getting in compliance with the standard, you implement a 5-part plan to get in compliance with that. Number 1, that you train your personnel on how to do this properly out on the roadway. Number 2, you find some sort of manual or documentation that's going to show them how to set up work zones properly, whether you use a small pocket guide like our company manufacturer, you use the federal manual, or you write your own. You have some sort of practice and procedure in place. We suggest you document their training and the practice and procedure, as well as you document what you're doing in work zones. We suggest you update the practice and procedure and the training, as well as the equipment, to bring it in compliance with the standard. And then finally, you have some sort of inspection or audit function in place at your company in order to make sure that your work zones are being done properly out on the roadway. Okay, the final thing I'll do is entertain you just for a moment before I'll take questions and answers, Jim and I. This is not the proper way to do a cone taper, regardless of whether you're in Southern California or not. Okay, this one here, this will cause a serious problem if a motorist hits that and a spark ensues. That's a small explosive device, and it cannot be used, especially if it doesn't have a reflectorized collar on it. I'm just kidding. You cannot steal the neighbor's recycling bin, even though it's orange. It doesn't work. The other point I'll make on this work zone, and a lot of times this happens, this is a tree trimming company is doing short-term work, and you'll notice that they've cut their branches and closed this sidewalk off here. And we actually had a 12-year-old boy killed in Lockport, New York, who walked down a sidewalk like this, and a utility company was doing some overhead line work. And the boy walked down the sidewalk and it was closed. Instead of going back and crossing at the intersection, he walked out around the truck like this and was killed in a lane of traffic. So if you do close that sidewalk down, obviously you need to take into consideration the pedestrian traffic that you would have to relocate when you did that. Now, what's wrong with this work zone? Can anybody tell me? First of all, I have no clue why this sign is facing this direction. Okay, the motorists are coming from that way. This is talking to the people over here. It should be on this side of the roadway. Number 2 is the sign's not technically the right sign in terms of size and legend and all that stuff. That's just another kind of work zone we saw. This one here is really kind of interesting. They've actually taken a tripod stand, and because the wind blows it over quite a bit, they took another sign stand off their truck and tied rope to it here to make a weight to actually hold this down so it doesn't blow over. The problem with that is if you impact this thing under NCHRP 350 guidelines, I guarantee you that it's probably going to perform well until that sign stand right there, as the weight hanging in the middle enters the driver compartment through the windshield, because it's too, it's a weight right in the middle of the windshield height. That's probably not a good idea. This one here we thought was cute. That, Jim, just so you know, that is a lane opening sign rather than a lane closure sign. I don't know who put that out on the roadway that way. We also joke that this is the flagger station right here. That's where he takes his nap before he flags that properly. Anyways, you do need to use the right proper equipment out on the roadway, and the federal manual does tell you what that proper equipment is. I'm not going to cover the flagging issue today. That's pretty much what I have time for, so Jim and I will go ahead and take questions from you today if you have any questions for us on short-term work.